This is the second of 3 lectures on Plato's dialogue, the Crito. There's a perennial joke about 2 elderly women vacationing at the Berkshires. I guess that's sort of an East Coast joke, but if you know what the Berkshires are, you get it. 2 elderly women vacationing at the Berkshires. One says to the other over lunch, one says, "You know, the food here is so terrible." And the second one says, "I know, and such small portions." And of course, the joke is the irony of, why would you complain about not getting enough bad food, right? You would only want more food if the food was decent, okay, or good, or at least edible. So, why do I start by mentioning that? Crito has said to Socrates, "Well, you always say that life is sacred, and yet here you are throwing years away as if it is something worthless." The reply that Socrates makes is that we don't simply want duration, we want the best possible life. We want to live well, not simply live long. Why prolong your life if the extra years you get are going to be miserable? Okay, it would be a sort of very, very counterproductive fear of death that would lead you to sacrifice the quality of life just to live a few more years. Now that is a point that is very important that would enter into any discussion of such things as euthanasia, assisted suicide, any ethical choices regarding lifestyle. Am I putting myself at risk? Well, if by doing that I am increasing the quality of my life, then perhaps I'm willing to make that trade-off. I won't live as long in all likelihood, but I will live better. Okay. John Wayne, the famous actor, starred in westerns, tough guy roles and so forth, died of lung cancer a few decades ago. And he was observed to be smoking cigars right up to the time of his death. He was asked, why, if you're dying of lung cancer, would you be smoking cigars? And he said, "I really enjoy smoking cigars. And if I have only a short amount of time left, I'm going to enjoy that short amount of time." Well, okay, you may say, "I would never make that choice." You may say, "Yeah, that actually makes sense to me." Or you might say, "You know what? None of my business." Everyone has to make that trade-off. How much am I willing to sacrifice to live longer? But what's the point of living longer if you're not living well? Okay. In the tail end of Plato's Republic, there's a portion called the myth of retelling of a myth in which souls waiting to be reincarnated are casting lots for what they're going to be born as in their next life. And Odysseus is the hero of the Odyssey. Odysseus, sometimes known by his Roman name, his Ulysses, but for the Greek it's Odysseus. Well, Odysseus draws the lot of an ordinary farmer. And of course, he's been this great hero, this notoriously clever strategizer. He's had these amazing adventures, but he says, I would have chosen no other life but this, a simple, ordinary, plain life. Because I just want to live. I just want to live as happily as possible in my next life. Okay? On the other hand, Achilles, the hero of the Iliad, as the story goes, is given a choice. Do you want a long but utterly ordinary life as a farmer? Or do you want a short, difficult, brutal life in which you will be a glorious hero? And Achilles says, I will be the glorious hero. I will live a shorter time. I will live with more difficulty, but my life will have far more significance and far more meaning. Okay, again, you may or may not agree with his choice. You may say, I would choose that too, or you may say, I would never choose that. Or you may just say, none of my business. It's an individual choice. I had a student in moral issues a few years ago who said, she said, the one thing that I have learned coming from a very religious household and a very sort of conservative household was this. The one thing I've learned is that there are plenty of times when it's just none of my business what choice somebody else makes. And if we live in a world where people respect the right of others to make their own choices, we'll probably all be better off. Okay. Now, what are we talking about here? How come we're talking about this? Well, Socrates is going to lay out the principles he says he's lived by his whole life. They are field tested. His whole life is testimony that this makes for a better personal life and better social relations and the best contribution you can make to society. So, Crito, if you're going to ask me to abandon these principles just to live a little longer, forget it. I'm not going to try to live a little longer at the price of sacrificing the very things that made my life worth living to begin with. Okay, you notice that, as I mentioned in the prior lecture, Socrates was accused by his prosecutors of being an atheist and of worshiping foreign gods, which is inconsistent, as he points out at his trial. If I worship any gods, I'm not an atheist. If I am an atheist, I don't worship foreign gods. So what do you want to accuse me of? Because, you're making inconsistent accusations. The response of the prosecutors is more or less, you see how tricky he is? Well, he's not being tricky. He's actually being clear about their errors. I many times marvel at how much this parallels contemporary political debate. Let me see how many things I can baselessly accuse you of. The saying goes, if you throw enough mud, something's bound to stick. I'll just call you all kinds of names in an attempt to discredit you. And if you point out that I've got my facts wrong, if you point out that I'm not making any sense, then you simply reply by saying, look at how tricky he is. Look at how shifty he is to try to wriggle out of the accusations I've made. Well, what if those accusations aren't accurate? Okay, 3 principles. These will be outlined in your study aids for the Crito. First has come to be called rational reflection. You won't find that actual phrase in the Crito, but this is what the literature, the discussion of Crito over the centuries has come to call it. Principle of rational reflection. What is the principle of rational reflection? First of all, it's the idea that in matters of moral significance, one should act on principle, not just randomly, not just shoot from the hip, but have good reason for what you're doing. You should have thought out what your values are, what your principles are, what the consequences for different courses of action might be. You should act on principle. And if you're going to act on principle means that you're going to be willing to universalize. That is to say, I will accept as a rule that anybody else in the situation I'm in, faced with the choices I'm faced with, should decide in this way. I'm willing to embrace that. Does that mean no exceptions? For Socrates, it certainly doesn't. For some later philosophers, it will. But for Socrates, it certainly doesn't, because he names all kinds of exceptions to the rules. We act on principle, not just randomly. For example, if I decide to wear this tie today, There's no moral principle that's hanging on that. Okay? If I decide to cheat on my taxes, there is a moral principle there. Okay? Some choices carry a moral dimension and some do not. And, I can just reach into my closet and grab any tie I like. I can do that more or less randomly. It doesn't matter. What shall I have for dinner tonight? Well, what's in the refrigerator? Well, let's see. I'll grab this, this, and this. Again, this is not something that I have to necessarily think about at great length and make into a bigger issue than it actually is. And this doesn't mean that you can never be spontaneous in your choices. Of course you can. But it's your rational mind that tells you when it's okay to be spontaneous and when it isn't. The belief that you should always be spontaneous is that gets us teen pregnancies and road rage and riots. Okay? Now, sometimes you should think through the consequences and the alternatives. And there are other times when it's perfectly okay to be spontaneous. Okay? So act on principle, not just randomly. What if those principles come into conflict? Well, how could they come into conflict? Well, let's see. Rules can clearly come into conflict with each other. What if my principle is that you should always act out of particular kinds of motives, benevolent motives? What if I'm saying, what about results? We should judge by results. There are any number of different strategies we're going to look at where we will discover it's perfectly possible to have decisions that you justify by your own moral strategy coming into conflict with other decisions, other kinds of principles that seem equally well justified. Okay, so a decision procedure should be able to tell us when the rules are actually going to work for us and when we're going to have to simply think something through given a number of variables in the current context. Give you an example. I knew you wanted an example. Well, here's an example. To begin with, Book 1 of Plato's Republic. I refer to that a lot because it's a lovely piece of philosophical writing. I used to use that in my intro philosophy course, but you can't do everything. Eventually, I had to make room for other material. But Book 1 of the Republic, Socrates is talking with an old friend about the importance of living a good life, because when you get old, like Socrates, or like the friend he's talking to, his friend Cephalus, when you get old, you don't want to wake up in the middle of the night worried, did I live a good life? Will I have to pay for the wrongs I've done in the afterlife? Will I leave a bad reputation after me? Will anybody care about me when I'm old and dependent upon the decency or charity of others? Okay? So, says Cephalus, one thing that is helpful is if you believe, you have good reason to believe that you've lived a just life. If you've done such things as repay your debts, keep your promises, tell the truth, he gives those as examples. In all fairness, he's not trying to give a definition, he's just giving examples. And Socrates says, well, those examples, that can't be the definition of doing the right thing, can it? Because isn't it, for instance, telling the truth, or keeping your promises, or repaying your debts, are those things that can sometimes be right and sometimes wrong? Most of the philosophers will say that, pretty much those are bedrock principles, but Socrates points out they're not always the right thing to do. For instance, let's say you borrow a weapon from a neighbor, and you solemnly promise, on this particular date, I will give the weapon back to you. Now, in the interim, let's say the neighbor goes stark raving mad. Socrates asks, what sensible person is going to say that the right thing to do, the best thing to do, that if we put it in the terms we've used before, what will expedite the good, is to put a weapon into the hands of a raving madman. Yes, you did make a promise, but you better figure out something else to do, because you can't just put a weapon into the hands of a madman who's going to hurt other people or himself. Or telling the strict truth to a madman. Say the neighbor gets a hold of a weapon and comes to your door, boom, 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 where's your mother? And say, oh, well, I couldn't lie. That would be immoral. She's hiding from you in the closet. And then after, he goes all OJ on her. You don't want to, you're going to sit back and say, well, not my fault. After all, I couldn't lie, could I? Well, actually, yeah, probably you could have in those circumstances. Okay? And some philosophers will say, no, you must never lie. And others will say, be reasonable. Yeah. If you look at what you're trying to accomplish by having rules against lying, you are totally undermining those very goals about living humanely, being able to trust each other, and so forth. If you enable a madman to kill your own mother or something, okay. So the point is, saying that you will universalize, that you will have general rules that are guidelines for how you ought to act properly in order to expedite the good. That doesn't mean for Socrates that there will never be exceptions. Okay? Second principle, moral rectitude. Rectitude basically means uprightness. It's kind of an antique word, but again, it's the word that's used in discussion in the literature, so I'll just use it too. It's a nice peg on which to hang a number of ideas. Moral rectitude essentially means never returning a wrong for a wrong. Socrates points out that in Book 1 of the Republic, he has a parallel conversation. He says, when would a just person ever do harm to another? Well, only as a last resort, and only insofar as it's necessary to rectify an injustice or prevent an injustice. Okay? And you would never do gratuitous harm. You would never, try to harm a person's soul, if you will. Use terms that would be used later. Although you might use force. Okay? Never return a wrong for a wrong doesn't mean you can't defend yourself. It doesn't mean you can't even act preemptively to prevent a wrong. It doesn't mean you can't punish people who have done wrong. What it means is that your action must be constrained by the purpose of wanting to rectify a wrong or prevent a further wrong. It can't just be revenge. When George W. Bush is trying to put together what he called the coalition of the willing after 9/11, a number of people in Europe, in the newspapers and so forth, said, we need to know, is he talking about justice or is he talking about revenge? Because if it's revenge, forget it. Yes, you were wronged, but we don't want to get into a cycle of vengeance. If you're talking about, rectifying some injustice or preventing further injustice, that's a different matter. That, yes, we can get on board with that. Okay, never return a wrong for a wrong, I should say, is not the same as the so-called golden rule. And I only mention that because some students in the past have interpreted it that way. The golden rule, actually it appears in most morality in one form or another, and it certainly appears in every world religion. That is, every religion that is practiced not simply within a small cultural context, but has spread throughout the world. Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Confucianism, although some would debate whether that's a religion at all. All these things basically have something like the golden rule, as best known in our culture by the words of Jesus, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. That's not what moral rectitude is about. Moral rectitude says, don't do harm for the sake of harming. It's not the same. do unto others as you'd have them do unto you, is also an admonition to act positively, to do good for others. Okay, to practice charity and and camaraderie and loyalty and this sort of thing, not simply to refrain from doing harm. Many philosophers have pointed out the golden rule is completely inadequate without further analysis. Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. When I was young, it was very commonplace for people to hug each other. Okay, today, I would hesitate to hug a stranger. Okay, because we live in a different cultural context where people are much more worried that there might be some sort of sexual dimension to it. If you are going to do unto others, do you know anybody who's an invertebrate hugger? It's fine if they're around other people who are cool with that, okay? And on the other hand, if they're going to be around people who feel like you're invading my space, what are you doing? Get your hands off me. Then they should not be doing it. Rationalizing the golden rule involves something like, let me understand, the most basic characterization I can give of how you would like to be treated, how I would like to be treated. One of which is respect my boundaries. Okay. So here we go. Here's an example. I'm being spontaneous. You probably can't read the lettering on my mug because it's very faded, but it says, I don't always listen to baby metal, but when I do, so do the neighbors. A friend of mine commented, yeah, that's why they throw the bricks through the window so that they can hear the music better. And I said, yeah, there was a note attached to one of the bricks that said, play Old Ma Janai again. Well, the point of that is not, you don't have to be familiar with this music, but the whole point of that is exactly, I like to listen to certain kinds of music. I'm not necessarily doing anybody a favor by creating a situation in which everybody has to listen to the same music that I like, any more than I would necessarily want to listen to what they like. My father was in the hospital many years ago. He was paralyzed by a stroke, and the nurse had on a radio in the room, and she had tuned it to a country station. And he probably didn't mind that, and that would not have been his first choice. I would have felt I was being tortured personally, and that's just my taste in music. And you like country music, that's fine. You're totally entitled to your taste in music. If the radio station had been turned on to a station that I would like, probably the nurse would have felt that I was being tortured. Okay, so do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. You better figure out how they want to be done unto. Okay. So anyway, so that's not the principle of moral rectitude. The principle of moral rectitude is to avoid harm when you can avoid harm, and to never use unprovoked, excessive, or gratuitous harm, never harm for the sake of harming. Now, one of the historically important consequences of that principle of moral rectitude comes from St. Augustine. If you're Catholic, you probably have already heard of St. Augustine. Augustine, to a large extent, invented the form of Christianity that we now know, and so was especially influential in the formation of the Catholic Church. Augustine, whether you agree with Augustine's conclusion, I think there's no serious disagreement about whether he was a very smart guy. He was in fact, a very, very smart guy. And according to Augustine, he always had both his Bible and the dialogues of Plato open on his desk. Indeed, his big philosophical project was, let me try to reconcile Platonic philosophy with Christian theology. And many of the basic tenets of Catholicism for which he was formative came out of that effort. Now, you may think that he got the Christian doctrines wrong. Some theologians would say so. You might think that he got Plato wrong. Some Platonic scholars would say that. In fact, I think he, on many points, got Plato wrong. But that the work was brilliant, that it was illuminating in many ways, is, I think, unquestionable.